The verdict that changed everything. The courtroom was deathly silent. A heavy tension hung in the air, pressing down on the gathered crowd like an invisible weight. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the judge's elevated seat, where Judge Anderson sat, glaring down at the woman standing before him. She was trembling. Her clothes were worn, barely holding together at the seams. Her dark hair, streaked with gray from years of hardship, was unkempt, and her thin frame was evidence of the hunger she had endured. Yet, despite her trembling hands, her eyes held a flicker of something defiant, something the judge found infuriating. "You have been caught stealing food from a local grocery store, Mrs. Thompson," Judge Anderson said, his voice cold and emotionless. His words cut through the silence like a blade. "You are nothing more than a burden on this society. It's people like you who make this country look bad. You should be ashamed of yourself." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The harshness of the judge's words left even the most cynical courtroom observers stunned. A few murmured to one another, while others simply stared in disbelief. The woman, Grace Thompson, a homeless woman with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, stood frozen as the words settled upon her like a crushing weight. For a moment, it seemed as if she might break. But then, in a moment that would shock everyone in that courtroom, Grace lifted her head. Her eyes, dull from exhaustion, suddenly burned with an intensity that no one had expected. "I may be homeless, Your Honor," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I have something you will never understand." The judge narrowed his eyes, irritated by her defiance. "And what could a woman like you possibly understand that I don't?" Grace took a deep breath, her frail shoulders rising and falling. "I know what it means to be truly hungry. I know what it feels like to have nothing. But I also know what it means to survive without pride, without dignity. You look at me and see a disgrace, a failure, but you don't know what it's like to be stripped of everything and still find hope." The room fell into complete silence. The judge's expression darkened, his fingers tightening around his gavel. The tension was thick, the air suffocating. And then, "Get out of my courtroom," he bellowed, his voice rising with frustration. He slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack echoing off the walls. "Now." But Grace didn't flinch. She didn't bow her head in shame or scurry away like he expected her to. Instead, she straightened her back and turned slowly, walking out with steady steps that echoed through the silent room. No one dared to speak. The judge sat back, stunned, his mind racing. There was something unsettling about her words, something he couldn't shake. But he quickly dismissed the thought. He was done with her. Or so he thought. Because what he didn't realize was that the moment Grace Thompson walked out of that courtroom, her story was just beginning. Part 2. The World's Indifference. The air outside was cold, biting against Grace's exposed skin as she stepped out of the courthouse. The city moved around her, indifferent to her existence. People hurried past, wrapped in warm coats, their conversations blending into a dull hum of normalcy, a normalcy she no longer belonged to. She walked aimlessly, her mind still reeling from what had just happened. She had known the judge would be cruel, but she hadn't expected his words to cut so deep. A burden. That was what he had called her. A burden to society. She clenched her fists. Was that all she was? Just another forgotten soul, taking up space. Her stomach growled, a painful reminder of the reality she lived in. She had stolen because she had no choice. Because hunger had become an unbearable beast that clawed at her insides day and night. And yet, to the world, she was just a thief. Grace made her way toward the small park where she often found shelter. The wooden bench under the old oak tree had become her home in the past weeks. The cold made it unbearable at times, but at least it was a place where no one looked at her with disgust. As she sat down, pulling her thin jacket tighter around herself, she noticed an elderly man sitting on the opposite bench. His face was lined with age and hardship, his eyes carrying the weight of 1,000 struggles. His clothes were just as tattered as hers. He was one of them, one of the invisible people, the forgotten ones. Grace hesitated, then spoke. "Mind if I sit here for a while?" The man looked up, his gaze steady. "It's a free world, child. Sit if you wish." She did, both of them sitting in silence for a long while. The distant sound of traffic filled the air, but it felt distant, like another world entirely. "You look like you've been through a lot," the man said after some time, his voice raspy but kind. Grace let out a dry laugh. "That obvious, huh?" He smiled sadly. "The world doesn't make it easy for people like us. But there's one thing I've learned after all these years. The world may try to break you, but it can't take away your heart. That's something they'll never understand." His words struck something deep within her. She had spent so long believing that she was invisible, worthless. But was she? Did she still have something left inside her? Something they couldn't take away? "I don't know if I can keep going," she whispered. "I feel so invisible. Like I don't matter." The old man's eyes softened. "You matter, child. More than you know. The world may be blind, but you don't have to be. Keep going, even when they try to make you feel like nothing." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with kindness, so long since she had felt seen. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. But that flicker was short-lived. Just as she stood up to leave, a voice called out behind her. "Grace Thompson." She froze. "We need to talk." She turned around slowly. The man standing before her was tall, his face obscured by the shadows cast by the streetlights. He wore a dark suit, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. She had never seen him before, and yet there was something in his eyes, something urgent. Her heart pounded. Who was he? And why did he know her name? The answers were coming, and they would change everything. A world that looks away. The cold gnawed at Grace's bones as she walked through the streets of Chicago, her breath fogging in front of her face. The courthouse loomed behind her, its cold marble walls standing as a monument to a justice system that had long since turned its back on people like her. The words Judge Anderson had spoken still rang in her ears. Burden, disgrace, failure. She pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her as she stepped onto the sidewalk. No one looked at her. No one ever did. Pedestrians walked by in warm coats, their hands stuffed in their pockets, their gazes fixed ahead, purposefully avoiding her presence. She had become invisible, just another piece of the city's background noise, like the wind howling between the skyscrapers. Her stomach churned. It had been 2 days since her last meal. She had eaten nothing but scraps left behind in dumpsters, a humiliating routine that had become her life. She had hoped, foolishly, that the courtroom would be different, that someone would see her, that someone might understand. Instead, she had been cast aside, just like before. As she made her way toward a small park on the city's outskirts, she passed a cafe with a warm, glowing interior. The scent of fresh coffee and pastries wafted into the street, making her stomach ache with hunger. Inside, people sat at polished wooden tables, sipping laughing, eating food they barely thought twice about. Her feet hesitated. A half-eaten sandwich sat abandoned on a plate near the window. The woman who had been eating it was too busy scrolling on her phone to notice it. Grace's mouth watered, but she shook her head and forced herself to keep walking. She wasn't going to stoop to that. Not today. She reached the park just as the last traces of sunlight faded into the horizon. The bare trees stretched their skeletal limbs toward the darkening sky, the only witnesses to her daily struggle. The park was quiet, the benches empty except for one. An old man sat there, his frail frame hunched against the cold. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, his beard white and patchy. His coat was just as ragged as hers, his hands calloused and weathered from years of hardship. Grace hesitated before approaching. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. The man looked up, his tired eyes meeting hers. After a long pause, he nodded. "It's a free world. Sit." She sank down beside him, wrapping her arms around herself, They sat in silence, listening to the distant hum of traffic. After a moment, the man let out a quiet sigh. "You've been through a lot." Grace scoffed. Understatement of the year. The man turned his head slightly, studying her. "You look like you've just had a run-in with the system." Grace snorted. "Yeah. And guess what? It didn't go well." The old man didn't ask questions. He didn't pry. Instead, he leaned back against the bench and stared at the sky. "The world doesn't care much about people like us," he said after a while. "You know that by now. But you want to hear a secret?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "Sure. Why not?" He smiled faintly. "The world may look away, but that doesn't mean we stop existing. They can ignore us, but they can't erase us." She swallowed hard. "Feels like they already have." The man shook his head. "Not if you don't let them." Grace opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, a voice cut through the darkness. "Grace Thompson." She froze. A man stood a few feet away, dressed in a dark suit, his hands tucked into the pockets of his long coat. He was tall, his hair neatly combed, his posture rigid. He looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not standing in a rundown park at night. The old man tensed beside her. "You know him?" "No," Grace whispered. The stranger took a step closer. His face was partially shadowed by the street lamp behind him, but his expression was unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. Grace's heart pounded. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to disappear into the city before this man could say another word. But something in his voice stopped her. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was urgency. A door to the past. The wind howled through the empty streets as Grace stared at the man standing before her. His presence felt out of place, too polished, too put together for a place like this. The neatly pressed suit, the expensive leather shoes, the rigid posture, it all screamed authority, but there was something beneath the surface, something uneasy. Grace's instincts screamed at her to run. Instead, she clenched her fists and squared her shoulders. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease growing in her chest. The man took a slow step forward, his hands still buried in the pockets of his long coat. "My name is Samuel Carter," he said. "I need to speak with you, and it's important." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Why?" "I don't know you." Samuel exhaled, looking past her as if scanning the park for potential eavesdroppers. "I know what happened in that courtroom," he said quietly. "And I know what's happening behind the scenes." Grace's breath caught in her throat. The old man beside her shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between her and Samuel. "This don't smell right," he muttered under his breath. "You sure you want to hear what he's got to say, girl?" Grace hesitated. Everything in her life had taught her not to trust men in suits. Men in suits had written her off, thrown her out, ignored her. Men in suits had looked through her like she was nothing more than a ghost in their perfect world. But Samuel Carter was different. There was something in his eyes, something desperate, and that scared her more than anything else. "Fine," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "Talk." Samuel glanced around one last time before stepping closer. "Not here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not safe." Grace let out a dry laugh. "Safe, buddy. I sleep on benches and dig through garbage for food. Nowhere is safe for me." Samuel didn't smile. "It's about Judge Anderson." The name sent a shock through Grace's system. She inhaled sharply, her fists tightening at her sides. "What about him?" she asked, her voice suddenly deadly quiet. Samuel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He's not just a judge," he said. "He's part of something bigger. And you." He paused, his gaze locking onto hers. "You were never supposed to walk out of that courtroom." Silence. The words lingered between them, thick with meaning. Grace's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Samuel's expression darkened. "You think you were just another case to him. Just another petty theft trial. You weren't." He took another step forward. The way he humiliated you, the way he threw you out. It wasn't just because he thought you were a burden. Grace shook her head, her mind racing. That doesn't make sense. I'm nobody. Samuel exhaled. Not to them. Grace's pulse thundered in her ears. This was insane. This was impossible. She was just another forgotten woman scraping by in a city that had long since abandoned her. There was nothing special about her. Nothing worth noticing. So why was Samuel Carter looking at her like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve? The old man on the bench cleared his throat. You better be real careful, girl, he warned. Once people like him start talking about secrets, you're already in deep. Grace turned to him, searching his face for some kind of guidance, but he just shook his head. Samuel sighed. I can explain everything, but not here, he said. There are people who don't want you to know the truth. And if you don't leave with me right now, they're going to find you first. Grace's stomach twisted. This was insane. This was paranoia. But there was something in Samuel's voice, something she couldn't ignore. Truth. She swallowed hard. If she left with him, she could be walking into something dangerous, something far worse than homelessness, than hunger. But if she stayed, she had a feeling she wouldn't be given another chance. She took a deep breath. Where are we going? She asked. Samuel's shoulders relaxed just slightly, but the tension in his eyes didn't fade. A place where you can finally get some answers. And with that, he turned and started walking. Grace hesitated only for a second. Then, against every instinct she had, she followed. The city lights flickered through the thick fog settling over the streets as Grace followed Samuel Carter through the darkened alleyways. She wasn't sure why she was trusting him, or if she even was trusting him. But the way he spoke, the way his eyes darted over his shoulder every few steps, told her something undeniable. This wasn't a game. This wasn't paranoia. Something was wrong. And for some reason, she was tangled up in it. They walked in silence for a while, weaving through side streets, avoiding well-lit areas, until Samuel finally stopped in front of a rusted metal door set into the side of an old brick building. He pulled a key from his pocket, hesitated, then turned to look at her. This is the last time I'll ask, he said, his voice grave. Are you sure you want to know the truth? Grace folded her arms across her chest. I've already come this far. Samuel exhaled and unlocked the door. The interior of the building was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and something else, something old and forgotten. The space looked like a storage room, filled with filing cabinets, stacks of papers, and flickering computer monitors set up on makeshift desks. She hadn't expected this. She had expected an office, a police station, some kind of official place. But this looked like a hideout. Samuel gestured for her to sit in a chair opposite one of the desks. He moved with the tense efficiency of someone who didn't waste time. Grace hesitated before lowering herself onto the chair, her hands gripping the armrests. All right, she said. Start talking. Samuel leaned against the desk, arms crossed. Everything that happened in that courtroom. It wasn't just about you. Grace narrowed her eyes. You keep saying that, but I don't see how some random homeless woman stealing food is connected to. You weren't random. Samuel interrupted, his voice sharp. Grace froze. Samuel let out a slow breath. Judge Anderson is dirty. I've been investigating him for over a year. He's been involved in multiple fraudulent cases, accepting bribes, covering up crimes, and influencing verdicts. But his power isn't just in the courtroom. It runs much deeper. Grace swallowed hard. What does that have to do with me? Samuel reached for a file on the desk, flipping it open. Inside were pages of legal documents, newspaper clippings, and a grainy black and white photograph. He slid the photo toward her. Grace hesitated before picking it up. Her breath hitched. It was a picture of her. Not from the courthouse. Not from the streets. It was from before she had lost everything. before she had become just another nameless figure wandering the city. The photo was taken outside her old apartment building. She stared at it, her fingers trembling. How did you get this? Samuel's expression was grim. Because Judge Anderson knew exactly who you were before you stepped into that courtroom. Grace's heart pounded. That's impossible, she whispered. He didn't know me. I was just another case on his list. Samuel shook his head. No, you were targeted. Grace felt the world tilt. She shook her head. No, that doesn't make sense. I lost everything on my own. My job, my home. No one did that to me. It just happened. Samuel hesitated. Did it? Grace's breathing quickened. She wanted to argue, to call him a liar. But a memory surfaced, one she had long buried. Her eviction had come fast. Too fast. She had fallen behind on rent after losing her job at the insurance firm she worked at, but her landlord had been understanding. At least at first. Then, suddenly, he wasn't. Her eviction notice had come before she even had time to find another job. The job loss itself had been strange, too. She had worked for the company for years, had been a model employee. Then, out of nowhere, the company shut down overnight. No warning, no severance, nothing. At the time, she had chalked it up to bad luck. Now, sitting in that dimly lit room, staring at a picture of herself taken before she had even become homeless, her stomach twisted. Why? She whispered. Why would someone target me? Samuel reached for another file, flipping it open. Because of this. He placed a document in front of her. Grace's eyes scanned the words, her vision blurring with shock. It was a legal contract. One she had never seen before. One with her name on it. And Judge Anderson's. She couldn't breathe. What is this? Samuel's voice was steady but heavy. It's a record of a property dispute. Years ago, you were the last remaining tenant in an apartment complex that was set to be demolished for a new development project. The owners needed everyone gone, but you. He tapped the document. Had a rent control contract that protected you. They couldn't force you out. Not legally. Grace's mouth went dry. So they found another way. Samuel nodded grimly. Your company's sudden shutdown. The eviction. It wasn't random, Grace. It was orchestrated. The developers needed you out, so they pulled strings. They made you lose your job, pushed you onto the streets, made sure you had nothing left. The words felt like acid against her skin. She had thought she had just been unlucky. She had thought the world had just been cruel. But this was calculated. Her entire downfall had been planned. She clenched her fists. Why? Why go through all that trouble just to get rid of me? Samuel hesitated, then pulled another document from the file. Because they weren't just evicting you. They were covering up something bigger. Grace grabbed the document and scanned it. Her hands shook. It wasn't just a property dispute. It was a fraud case. Her old apartment building had been the site of illegal financial dealings, deals that involved Judge Anderson himself. And Grace had unknowingly been the last witness. Her presence in that building, her refusal to leave, she had been an obstacle in their scheme. So they had removed her. Piece by piece. They had destroyed her life to protect their secret. The air in the room felt suffocating. Grace's pulse pounded in her ears. This can't be real, she choked out. Samuel sighed. I wish it wasn't, but it is. Grace stared at the documents, her mind racing. The humiliation, the suffering, the years of being invisible. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck. It had been done to her. She felt something inside her shift. A fire ignited. She had spent years believing she was worthless, that her fall had been her own doing, that she was just another lost soul in the city's gutters. But now she knew the truth. Her downfall had been planned, and the people responsible were still out there. Judge Anderson, the developers, the people who had turned her life into nothing. Her hands tightened around the edges of the documents. She had been powerless once. Not anymore. She looked up at Samuel. "What do we do next?" And just like that, Grace Thompson was no longer just a homeless woman. She was a woman with a purpose, a woman ready to fight back. The weight of the truth. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. The papers in Grace's hands trembled, but her grip tightened, her knuckles turning white. She had spent years believing she was just another forgotten person swallowed by the merciless machine of society. Another statistic. But now she knew better. Now she knew she had been erased on purpose. Her chest burned with something unfamiliar. Not just anger. Not just sadness. It was rage. Deep, blistering rage at the people who had taken everything from her. Her job, her home, her dignity. She looked up at Samuel Carter, who watched her with quiet patience, waiting for her to process the weight of what he had just revealed. His face, though calm, carried exhaustion in the lines around his mouth. He had known the truth for a long time. And now, so did she. "I want to see him," Grace said suddenly, her voice low but sharp as glass. Samuel's eyebrows knitted together. "Who?" She didn't blink. "Judge Anderson." Samuel sighed, rubbing his temples. "Grace, that's not a good idea. Not yet. If you go to him now, it'll only tip him off that we're onto him." "We?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. Samuel hesitated for a fraction of a second before he nodded. "Yes, we." Grace studied him. "You're not just some lawyer, are you?" He let out a dry chuckle. "Not exactly." She waited for him to explain, her fingers still curled around the edge of the papers that had just rewritten her entire past. Samuel folded his arms. "I used to work as an investigative journalist." Grace's stomach twisted. "Used to." His face darkened slightly. "The last time I got close to exposing something like this, I lost my job. The people involved in these kinds of crimes, they don't just cover their tracks. They erase people, not unlike what happened to you." A cold shiver ran through Grace's spine. "So why are you helping me?" Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because you're proof that these people need to be stopped, and because I'm not going to let them do to you what they did to me." Grace sat back, exhaling slowly. She felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, that she was stepping into something too big to comprehend. But what choice did she have? Go back to the streets? Pretend none of this was real? No, not anymore. She straightened her posture. "Then we go after him. Expose him." Samuel shook his head. "Not that simple. Anderson is protected. He's not just a corrupt judge. He's connected to people who make judges. People with power, resources, money." Grace felt her jaw tighten. "So what? We just sit here and do nothing." Samuel stared at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out another folder. "No," he said. "We hit them where it hurts." Grace frowned as he opened the folder, revealing photographs. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. The images showed large, polished buildings, security guards stationed at entrances, high-end cars parked in private lots. "What am I looking at?" Samuel tapped the top image. "This is Harrogate Investments, a major real estate firm, the same firm that bought your old apartment complex." The name sent a chill through Grace. She swallowed. "They were the ones who forced me out." Samuel nodded. "And they didn't just stop with you. Over the past 5 years, they'd been systematically targeting low-income tenants, forcing them out of their homes so they can build luxury developments. And they're using people like Judge Anderson to make it all legal." Grace clenched her fists. She had always believed she was alone, that her suffering was just bad luck. But now she realized she was part of something much bigger, a cycle that had crushed hundreds of people like her. She looked at Samuel. "So we take them down." He gave a grim smile. "That's the idea." Grace exhaled. "How?" Samuel leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I have a contact, a former Harrogate employee, someone who worked on the inside. If we can get them to talk, we'll have more than enough to bring this whole thing into the light. Grace nodded. Where is this person? Samuel hesitated. She's in hiding. Grace frowned. Why? Because she's scared, Samuel admitted. She knows how dangerous these people are. If they find out she's talking. He trailed off, but Grace understood. If she talks, Grace said slowly, will that be enough? Samuel leaned back, considering. It would be a start. We'd need proof, financial records, internal emails, something that ties Anderson directly to Harrogate. Grace's heart pounded. She had spent years believing she was nothing. That she had nothing. Now, for the first time in a long time, she had something that mattered. The truth. And if she could use it to burn down the people who had destroyed her, even better. She squared her shoulders. Take me to her. Samuel hesitated. Are you sure? Once you go down this road, there's no turning back. Grace met his eyes. They already took everything from me. What else do I have to lose? Samuel studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, he said, grabbing his coat. Let's go. The car's engine hummed softly as it moved through the dimly lit streets of Chicago. Grace sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, watching the blurred cityscape pass by. Her thoughts raced, colliding with one another as she tried to piece everything together. She had been set up. Her entire downfall, from losing her job, to being evicted, to ending up on the streets, had been orchestrated by people who never even knew her name. She had been nothing more than an obstacle in her way, another problem to be eliminated. Her stomach twisted with rage. She glanced at Samuel Carter, who was focused on the road, his grip firm on the wheel. He had been investigating Judge Anderson for years, but the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. If she hadn't walked into that courtroom, she would have never known the truth. And now, knowing what she knew, she couldn't walk away. Samuel had made it clear. They needed more than just accusations. They needed proof, concrete, undeniable proof that would not only expose Anderson, but bring down the entire corrupt network behind him. And the first step, finding the whistleblower. Grace shifted in her seat. You said this woman used to work for Harrogate Investments. Samuel nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. Yeah, name's Julia Evans. She was an administrative assistant in one of their executive offices. Not high-ranking, but she saw everything. The bribes, the fake documents, the illegal evictions. Grace clenched her jaw. And now she's in hiding. Samuel's mouth pressed into a thin line. She's terrified. She tried going to the police, but before she could testify, someone broke into her apartment, ransacked the place, left a warning on her bathroom mirror. Grace shivered. What kind of warning? Samuel's voice darkened. A single word, written in red lipstick. Stop. Grace inhaled sharply. She had seen fear before, lived with it, slept beside it, carried it with her through the streets. But this was different. These people weren't just powerful. They were dangerous. Samuel slowed the car as they pulled into a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The houses here were old but well-maintained, the kind of place where people didn't ask too many questions. He parked near a small, run-down motel with flickering neon lights. This is it? Grace asked, peering out the window. Yeah, Samuel said. She's in one of the rooms. But listen, she's skittish. If we go in there too aggressively, she'll shut down completely. Grace nodded. Got it. They stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at Grace's skin. She pulled her coat tighter around her as she followed Samuel up a flight of rusted metal stairs. The motel's hallway smelled of mildew and old carpet. Samuel stopped in front of room 206 and knocked 3 times, firm but not aggressive. Silence. Then, a faint rustling behind the door. A shadow moved behind the curtain. Julia, Samuel called softly. It's me. You know I wouldn't come here unless it was important. More silence. Then the sound of a chain sliding free and a deadbolt turning. The door cracked open just enough for a pale, tired face to peek out. Julia Evans looked exhausted. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, her face gaunt, her once blonde hair now a dull shade of brown, likely dyed to avoid recognition. She glanced at Grace suspiciously before looking back at Samuel. "You weren't supposed to come back," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel held up his hands. "I wouldn't be here unless I had to." Julia hesitated before glancing down both ends of the hallway, then finally opening the door. "Get inside." Quickly. Grace stepped into the small motel room, scanning the space. The curtains were taped to the wall to prevent peeking. The locks on the door had been reinforced with makeshift security measures. An old suitcase sat in the corner, half-packed. Julia was ready to run. Samuel closed the door behind them, locking it. Julia crossed her arms, eyeing Grace warily. "Who is she?" Grace met her gaze. Someone they try to erase. Julia's lips parted slightly, something flickering in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. She studied Grace a moment longer before nodding and sitting down on the edge of the bed. "So," she said, "tell me what you want." Samuel stepped forward. "We need evidence, something solid. You saw the internal documents, right?" Julia let out a humorless laugh. "Of course I did. You think they just hid everything?" "No. They were arrogant. They left a paper trail a mile long. I saw records of backdoor deals, property transfers signed by Anderson, even payments to city officials. It's all there." Grace leaned in. "Do you still have any of it?" Julia hesitated. For a moment, Grace thought she was going to say no, that she had destroyed it all out of fear. But then Julia took a slow breath. "I made copies." Grace's pulse quickened. Julia stood, walking over to the dresser. She pulled out a shoebox from the bottom drawer and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, thick manila folders were stacked, filled with printouts, emails, and handwritten notes. Samuel let out a slow whistle. "Jesus, Julia. This is what's left," Julia said. "Most of the original files are gone. Harrogate wiped their servers. But I took screenshots, emails, anything I could before they noticed." Grace reached for one of the documents and froze. It was an official court order, with her name on it. She stared at it, her hands shaking. This is my eviction case." Julia nodded grimly. "You weren't just a random tenant, Grace. You were the last one. The only one who didn't take their buyout. They needed you gone." Grace felt her throat tighten. She had spent years believing she was nothing, that her fall had been her fault. But it had been planned, calculated, and these papers were the proof. She looked up at Julia. "If we take this to the press?" Julia shook her head quickly. "No, you don't understand. You think this is just about Anderson and Harrogate. It's bigger than that." Samuel frowned. "How big?" Julia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the shoebox. "Harrogate wasn't just building apartments," she said. "They were laundering money. Millions of dollars. Some of it went through the courts. Some of it through political campaigns." Samuel's face darkened. Grace felt a chill creep down her spine. "They weren't just evicting people," Julia whispered. "They were making sure no one could fight back." Silence filled the room. Then, suddenly, bang, bang, bang. Someone pounded on the motel door. Grace's blood ran cold. Julia's eyes went wide with terror. She sprang up from the bed, already reaching for the shoebox. Samuel turned toward the door, his body tensing. "Julia," he said, his voice low. "Who else knows you're here?" Her hands trembled. "No one." Samuel reached into his coat, pulling out a gun. Grace's breath hitched, but she barely had time to react before. Crack. The door's lock splintered. Whoever was on the other side wasn't knocking anymore. They were coming in. Grace barely had time to move before Samuel grabbed her wrist and yanked her behind him. Julia grabbed the shoebox, clutching it to her chest as the door swung open. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. His face was calm. Too calm. "You should have listened," he said. Then he reached for the gun at his hip, and everything exploded into chaos. The whistleblower. The motel room erupted into chaos. The second the suited man reached for his gun, Samuel lunged, knocking him back into the doorway. The man grunted, but he was strong, too strong. He recovered quickly, his hand still reaching for the weapon at his hip. Grace's heart pounded as her body moved on instinct. She grabbed the first thing she could, an old lamp from the dresser, and hurled it at the intruder. The ceramic base shattered against his shoulder, making him stagger for just a moment. But a moment was all they needed. Samuel pulled his gun. "Stop," he barked, aiming it directly at the intruder's chest. The man froze. His breath was steady, his face eerily calm despite the weapon pointed at him. He held up his hand slowly, but there was no fear in his eyes. "Smart move," Samuel muttered. "Now tell me who the hell sent you." The man's lips twitched into a small, unsettling smile. "You already know." A shiver ran down Grace's spine. Harrogate. Judge Anderson. Whoever these people were, they weren't just corrupt businessmen and shady landlords. They were bigger than that. They had power, real power. Samuel stepped forward, keeping his gun steady. "How did you find us?" The man didn't answer. Instead, his gaze flicked to Julia, who stood in the corner of the room, clutching the shoebox full of documents. His eyes were sharp, calculating. Julia sucked in a breath. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." The man's smile widened. "You really thought you could run forever, Julia." A sob choked its way up Julia's throat. She took a step back, her body shaking. I didn't tell anyone." "Then how did I find you?" The man murmured. The words sent a bolt of fear through Grace's chest. Someone had betrayed them. Someone had given Julia up. Samuel must have realized the same thing because his grip on the gun tightened. "Who else knows?" he demanded. The man tilted his head. "Enough." Then, without warning, his hand moved. Faster than Grace could react, he reached into his jacket, not for his gun, but for something else. A radio. Samuel barely had time to curse before the man pressed a button and spoke into it. "Room 206. Now." Julia let out a choked sob. Footsteps thundered up the stairs outside. "We have to go," Grace yelled. Samuel didn't hesitate. He grabbed Julia's arm, yanked the shoebox from her hands, and turned toward the window. With one swift motion, he lifted the butt of his gun and smashed the glass. Shards rained down onto the parking lot below. Julia gasped. "That's a 2-story drop. You want to wait for whatever's coming through that door instead," Samuel snapped. Grace didn't think. She climbed onto the windowsill, heart pounding, eyes locked on the dark pavement below. Samuel grabbed her wrist. "Jump. Roll. Don't stop." She took a deep breath and jumped. The air whooshed past her, the impact sending a shockwave up her legs as she hit the ground and rolled. Pain jolted through her, but she forced herself to move, pushing off the pavement. A second later, Julia landed beside her with a pained grunt. Samuel followed, hitting the ground hard but recovering fast. Then, gunfire. Bullets tore through the night, shattering the motel's window behind them. Grace let out a strangled cry as Samuel grabbed her and shoved her behind a parked car. "They're shooting at us," Julia gasped, her face pale with terror. "Did you think they'd just ask for the files back?" Samuel growled. More footsteps, more voices. They weren't just being chased anymore. They were being hunted. Samuel's gaze darted across the parking lot, searching for an escape. His car was too far away, blocked by 2 black SUVs that hadn't been there when they arrived. Grace's heart pounded as she spotted something in the distance. "A bus," she whispered. Samuel followed her gaze. A city bus, maybe half a block away, was pulling up to a stop. It wasn't ideal, but it was their only shot. "Go," Samuel ordered. They ran. More bullets cracked through the air as they sprinted across the parking lot, dodging between cars. Julia sobbed as she clutched the shoebox to her chest, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The bus doors hissed open. "Wait," Samuel yelled, waving frantically. The driver, an older man with tired eyes, blinked in confusion as 3 breathless, terrified people leaped onto his bus. "Close the doors," Samuel barked. The driver hesitated for half a second, then did as he was told. The doors hissed shut just as a black SUV came screeching around the corner. The bus pulled away from the curb. Grace collapsed into a seat, chest heaving, sweat slicking her skin. Samuel stood by the window, his gun hidden but still gripped tightly in his hand. Julia curled into herself, still clutching the shoebox, rocking slightly. The driver glanced at them through the rearview mirror. "You all look like hell." Samuel exhaled. "Rough night." The driver snorted. "Yeah, well, welcome to Chicago." For a moment, none of them spoke. They were alive. Barely. Grace swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She could still hear the gunshots, still feel the pavement beneath her as she ran. She had thought the courtroom had been her lowest point. She had been wrong. Julia sniffled beside her, pressing the shoebox tighter against her chest. Grace looked at her. "You okay?" she asked softly. Julia let out a breathless laugh. "No. Are you?" Grace didn't answer. Samuel sat down across from them, his face unreadable. "We can't stay in the city," he finally said. Grace's stomach turned. "What?" "They found Julia. They found us. They have people everywhere," Samuel said grimly. "We have the files, but we need time to go through them. We need to get out of Chicago." Grace stared at him. "Leave the city? Where would they go?" Samuel must have seen the hesitation in her face because he leaned forward, his voice low. "If we stay, they will kill us." Grace's throat tightened. The weight of his words settled deep into her bones. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. This was about survival. She clenched her fists. Fine. If they wanted to hunt her down, she'd make damn sure they regretted it. She met Samuel's gaze. "Where do we go?" Samuel hesitated for only a moment before saying 2 words. "New Orleans." Grace blinked. "Why there?" "Because that's where we'll find the next piece of the puzzle," Samuel said. And just like that, their fight had only just begun. The escape to New Orleans. The city lights blurred through the dirty windows of the Greyhound bus as it rumbled down the highway, heading south toward New Orleans. Grace sat stiffly in her seat, arms crossed over her chest, her mind racing with the weight of everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. They had nearly been killed. They had been hunted. And now, they were running for their lives. Julia sat beside her, still clutching the shoebox filled with damning documents like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Her fingers trembled around the edges of the worn cardboard, her eyes staring blankly out the window. Across from them, Samuel sat with his arms folded, his gaze constantly shifting to the aisle, the exits, the other passengers. Even now, when they were seemingly safe, he was on high alert. And for good reason. Harrogate and Judge Anderson weren't just corrupt. They were dangerous. They had people everywhere, connections that ran deep, and now that Grace, Julia, and Samuel had the evidence to bring them down, they weren't going to stop hunting them. Grace exhaled slowly, trying to calm her nerves. The bus ride was long, too long. Every minute that passed felt like another moment their pursuers could catch up to them. She glanced at Samuel. "Why New Orleans?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel didn't look at her immediately. His fingers tapped lightly against his armrest before he finally answered. Because that's where we'll find the missing link. Grace frowned. Missing link. Samuel finally turned to look at her. Judge Anderson isn't the top of the food chain, he said. He's just a piece of something much bigger. Harrogate is involved in more than just real estate fraud and money laundering. They're part of a massive network of corruption that spans multiple states. And one of the key players, the person who made all of this possible, is in New Orleans. Grace felt a chill crawl down her spine. Who? Samuel hesitated. The man who launders their money. Julia let out a quiet breath beside her. You're talking about Victor Moreau, aren't you? Samuel nodded grimly. Grace had never heard the name before, but the way Julia's face paled told her everything she needed to know. Who is he? Grace asked. Samuel exhaled. Moreau is a financial ghost. He moves money through shell companies, offshore accounts, and fake businesses so it's untraceable. He's been doing it for decades. Harrogate is just one of the clients he launders money for, but he's the key connection between the real estate fraud and the people funding it. Grace swallowed hard. And you think we can find him? Samuel's expression was tight. I know we can, because Julia used to work with someone who had direct access to his accounts. Julia flinched, hugging the shoebox tighter. Grace turned to her. Who? Julia hesitated, her lips parting slightly before she finally whispered, Marcus Holloway. The name meant nothing to Grace, but Samuel let out a breath, nodding. He's the one who leaked the first set of files we have on Harrogate, Samuel explained. He used to work in their accounting department before he went into hiding. Hiding? Grace echoed. Samuel sighed. The last person who tried to expose Moreau ended up dead. Marcus knew he was next. He disappeared before they could get to him. I have a contact who says he's been laying low in New Orleans, but no one's seen him in months. Grace felt the weight of the situation settling deep into her chest. So we're going to find him, she said. Samuel nodded. We don't have a choice. If we can get Holloway to talk, we'll have everything we need to destroy Anderson, Harrogate, and Moreau in one blow. Grace exhaled slowly. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. The arrival. The bus pulled into New Orleans just after dawn. The sky was a hazy mix of orange and gray, the city waking up with the scent of damp pavement and the distant sounds of jazz music from street performers setting up for the day. Grace stepped off the bus, the warm, humid air wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Where to first? She asked, adjusting the straps of the worn-out backpack she had grabbed before they fled Chicago. Samuel pulled out his phone, scrolling through his messages. We need to meet my contact. She's been keeping tabs on Holloway for the past few months. Julia let out a nervous breath. And you trust this contact? Samuel shot her a look. Do we have a choice? They made their way through the city, weaving through tourists and street vendors, until they arrived at a small cafe tucked between two old buildings. Samuel led them inside, scanning the space before spotting a woman sitting in the back corner. She was tall, dark-skinned, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She sipped a black coffee, her expression unreadable as she watched them approach. Samuel, she greeted coolly. Lena, Samuel said, sitting down across from her. Grace and Julia slid into the seats beside him. Lena's eyes flicked over them before she turned back to Samuel. So, you finally found your whistleblower. Julia stiffened. Samuel nodded. And we need to find Holloway. Lena exhaled slowly, setting her cup down. That's a problem. Samuel frowned. Why? Lena's jaw tightened. Because Holloway's already on the move. Someone found out he was hiding in New Orleans. Grace's heart clenched. Who? Lena leaned forward. Let's just say some very well-dressed men with deep pockets have been asking around. He's running. But he's still in the city, for now. Samuel's fists clenched. Where? Lena hesitated, then pulled out a small slip of paper from her jacket and slid it across the table. This is the last known location someone saw him, she said. It's not safe. You need to be careful." Samuel picked up the note, scanning it before tucking it into his pocket. Lena's gaze flickered to Grace. "You're the one Anderson humiliated, aren't you?" Grace straightened. "Yeah." Lena studied her for a long moment. Then she smirked. "Good." Grace frowned. "Good." Lena leaned back, sipping her coffee. "Because if you really want to bring these bastards down, you're going to need more than just evidence." Grace narrowed her eyes. "And what do I need?" Lena's smirk widened. "You're going to need to make them scared of you." Grace felt something stir inside her, something fierce, something burning. She had spent years being the one who was afraid. Maybe it was time for someone else to be. Samuel stood, slipping a few bills onto the table. "Let's go," he said. Grace inhaled deeply, steeling herself. They were running out of time. And their enemies were getting closer. The hunt for Marcus Holloway had begun. The humid air clung to Grace's skin as she followed Samuel and Julia down a narrow alley in the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter. The streets were alive with tourists, jazz spilling from open doors, the scent of spices and frying oil thick in the air. But beneath the music and the laughter, there was an undercurrent of danger, a tension Grace could feel deep in her bones. They were running out of time. Lena's words echoed in her head. "If you really want to bring these bastards down, you're going to need more than just evidence. You're going to need to make them scared of you." Grace clenched her fists. She wasn't the scared one anymore. Now, it was time to make them afraid. Tracking Marcus Holloway. Lena had given them a location, the last known place Marcus Holloway had been spotted before going underground. It was an old warehouse near the docks, abandoned for years but still standing, a relic of a city that had long since moved on. As they approached, Grace felt her heartbeat pick up. The building loomed ahead, its windows shattered, rusted metal doors slightly ajar. Samuel pulled his gun. "Stay close," he murmured. They slipped inside. The air was thick with dust, the scent of mildew and rotting wood filling Grace's nostrils. Broken crates and rusted tools littered the space, the dim light from the setting sun casting long shadows against the concrete walls. Somewhere in the darkness, something shifted. Grace's breath hitched. Then, a voice. "Who the hell are you?" Samuel raised his weapon. "Marcus Holloway." Silence. Then, from behind a stack of old barrels, a man emerged. He was thin, his clothes tattered, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. His dark eyes flicked between them, full of suspicion and something else. Fear. "Marcus Holloway." "You're wasting your time," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "I don't talk to journalists, and I definitely don't talk to dead men." Samuel didn't lower his gun. "We don't want to expose you. We want to bring them down. And we need your help." Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "You think I haven't tried?" He shook his head. "These people don't just kill you. They erase you. You don't exist after they're done with you. That's why I ran." Julia stepped forward. "We have the files, Marcus. We have proof. But we need your testimony to connect it all. Harrogate, Judge Anderson, Moreau, all of it." At the mention of Moreau's name, Marcus froze. Then his expression changed. He looked at Julia, then at Samuel, then, finally, at Grace. "You're her, aren't you?" he asked, his gaze locking onto her. Grace stiffened. "Her." Marcus took a slow step closer. "The woman from the courtroom," he said. "The one Anderson humiliated." Grace swallowed hard. "Yeah, that was me." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Then he laughed. But it wasn't humor. It was bitter. Dark. "I should have known," he muttered. "You're the key, aren't you?" Grace frowned. "What are you talking about?" Marcus ran a hand through his messy hair, exhaling sharply. "They tried to erase you, Grace," he said. "But it backfired." She shook her head. "I don't understand." Marcus smirked, though there was no joy in it. "Because of that trial, because of how public it was, your name is already in their system. It's on their records. And now, because you survived, because you are still standing, they can't just disappear you without raising suspicion. You're a loose end they never expected. Grace felt a cold shiver run through her. She had spent years feeling invisible. But now, the people who had ruined her life were watching her closely. Samuel stepped forward. Then we use that. We make it public. We make sure the whole world sees what they did to her. To Julia. To all the people they destroyed. Marcus hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'm in." The final move. The next 24 hours were a blur. With Marcus's help, they pulled together everything they had. Financial records, emails, internal documents that traced the money trail straight to Judge Anderson, Harrogate, and Victor Moreau. Samuel reached out to his old contacts in the media, journalists who still had enough integrity left to care about the truth. And then they went public. By morning, every major news outlet was running the story. Judy G. Daniel Anderson, exposed in massive corruption, SCANDL, HARROWGATNVSTMNTs, LNKED2 illegal PROPRTWACEEMES, Myelionans, Stujulian, thousands for CD from their homes. The whistleblowers speak out. Grace watched the news from a rundown motel room, the flickering TV screen illuminating her tired face. They had done it. They had ripped the truth into the light. But they weren't safe yet. The reckoning. That night, they moved again, switching locations twice before settling in another safe house. It wasn't paranoia. They knew the people they had exposed weren't going to go down quietly. They were going to retaliate. And they did. By midnight, Judge Anderson had gone missing. By morning, 2 executives from Harrogate had resigned. By the end of the week, Victor Moreau's accounts had been frozen by federal investigators. But the fight wasn't over. Because when powerful people fall, they drag others down with them. And Grace knew, deep in her gut, this wasn't the end. 1 month later, the courtroom was packed. The cameras flashed as reporters jotted down notes, their eyes trained on the witness stand. And there, sitting at the center of it all, was Grace Thompson. She had come full circle. From being condemned in a courtroom, to standing as the woman who brought the corrupt to their knees. She looked across the room, locking eyes with the man sitting at the defendant's table. Judge Anderson. His face was pale. His suit wrinkled. His once arrogant gaze now held something she had never seen before. Fear. Real, tangible fear. Grace leaned forward, speaking into the microphone. "I was never supposed to survive," she said. "I was supposed to disappear. But I didn't." The room was silent. She exhaled, steadying her voice. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person they stole from, every family they destroyed, every name they erased." She turned to the jury, her voice unwavering. "We see them now, and we're not looking away." The courtroom erupted. The cameras flashed. And in that moment, Grace Thompson knew. She had won.